So to fetch the inserted events from the database, we can again prepare a query. This time a pretty simple query where I want to select everything from events like this. And then here we can use the DB package and there our DB handle to call the query method to send that query just like this. Now we could also, as before, first prepare the query. We can do this down here as well, but I'm not doing it here because I simply want to show you both options. The difference is that when we prepare a query, it's essentially stored in memory, you could say, and then easily reuse it in a highly efficient way. So this query here would be stored by the SQL package, and it would be reusable with different values being used in a highly efficient way. That's why I'm preparing it here, because it is a slightly more complex query. On the other hand, this query is pretty easy to evaluate and execute by the SQL engine, and that's why I'm not preparing this. We could prepare it first as well, but it doesn't make a lot of sense here. Now I'm using query instead of exec here, which we could use as well, because query is typically used if you have a query where you want to get back a bunch of rows, which you then want to use, which is exactly what's the case here. Whereas exec is used whenever you have a query that changes data in the database, inserts data, updates data, and so on. It has nothing to do with this being a prepared query. We would have a query method there as well, as you can see, but instead it's really only related to what you're doing. If you have a query that changes stuff, it's exec. If you have a query that fetches data, it's query. So that is how we can fetch the rows from the events table, and query then will return a pointer to those rows, so to a value that holds those rows, or an error. So I get my rows or an error here. And of course, as always, we want to handle that error and return it so that we can handle it in the place where we called getAllEvents if something goes wrong. So my return value of getAllEvents therefore changes to two values where we have either that slice or an error. So here I will return nil as a value for that slice of events, and then the error if we have one. But after this if check, we know that we got some rows with data. And just as with this statement here, we actually have to close this access to our rows. And we should do this with defer to make sure that it's always closed when this function here is done. And then we can simply loop through all the rows to step by step read them and populate an events slice with that row data. So I'll add a new variable called events, which is such an event slice. And then we can use a for loop to go through our rows. And that can easily be done by using those rows and then the next method. Next returns a boolean, which is true as long as there are rows left, and false thereafter. And therefore this will keep the loop running for as long as there are rows to read. And it will proceed through all those rows step by step with every iteration. Inside of the for loop, we can therefore create a new event, which is of type event, so my custom struct here, and populate that by again using the rows value, and then there the scan method, which now reads the content of the row we're currently processing. And scan then works a little bit like the FMT package scan method, where you pass a pointer to scan so that it's populated with the data from the row. Though you don't just pass one pointer, but a bunch of pointers, one for every column that can be found in the row, in the order in which the columns were defined, so this order here. So here for my event, I want to start by populating the ID. So I pass that ID to scan, however, not the raw value like this, but instead a pointer to that. So a pointer to that ID field in that event struct. And we then do this for all those fields. So also for the name, and then for the description, and then for the location, like this. And then for the date time, and then for the user ID. And with that event struct here is populated with all the data we found in that row, which we're currently processing. Now scan can produce an error if it fails to read some data, so we should handle that and check if error is not equal to nil, in which case here I'll return nil for my events slice and then the error. But otherwise, after this if check, we can update this events slice here by setting it to a new slice that is produced by calling append, where we append this event, which we now populated with data, to that events slice. And then we return that events slice here and nil as a value for the error. And that is now the updated getAllEvents function, which now uses SQL to fetch all events. Now we'll have to update the code in the main Go file. Because there, when we get all events, that of course also can return an error. Hence, we should also handle that scenario that we got an error and send back an error response if that is the case. With Jin's context object here, and then the JSON method, where I'll set an error status code. And here we could use an internal server error, because anything could have gone wrong. Maybe the database connection wasn't available. So we set this 500 status code. And then we can quickly generate such a map here, where we set the error message to could not fetch events. Try again later, or something like this. And thereafter we return so that the other code here isn't executed. Now similarly, saving the event can also fail, so here we should also handle such a potential error and check if error is not equal to nil, and the error was already created before, so we just need the assignment operator here. But if we have an error, then I also want to send back such an error response there, so I'll copy it from up there and paste it down here. And we can also use this internal server error code here, but of course the message should be different. Here we can say could not create event, and then maybe also try again later. So that this is how we handle errors if we fail to save the event. Well, and with that, we should finally be using that database. So if we now run this again, the server should start up. And if we start by creating an event and we send this request, that should work. We should not get an error. But now we should be able to quit this server with Ctrl+C and restart it. And normally before, the data now would have been lost, but now we should be able to set such a getEvents request and still get that event that we saved before. Because now it was not saved in memory, but instead in the database.